Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, June 14th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about 2024 election polls. Today, on your screen right now, Minnesota now has Donald Trump in the advantage point in a head-to-head matchup against President Biden, according to a bunch of recent polls that have been released in this state. That comes at the same time that Virginia now has President Trump leading President Biden in, again, a head-to-head matchup across 18 recent polls in which President Trump has a 0.2% lead. Now, today's video was inspired by some of the articles that were birthed out of the leads here for President Trump in Virginia and Minnesota. Articles that had come even weeks ago that were discussing some of the polls that suggested that President Trump was up by 30 points amongst young Minnesota voters, that President Trump was dominating President Biden in head-to-head matchups in a state that President Biden won by a pretty significant amount in the last election. Virginia, most recently, the Wall Street Journal today published an article titled, "Virginia Hasn't Backed a Republican for President in 2 Decades. Is it about to flip?" When we see articles like these, and a lot of media speculation, both in and out of social media, both in and out of the mainstream press, all of this conversation around President Biden and President Trump winning in either of these 2 states is pretty much solely fueled by what we see when it comes down to opinion polls. And almost nothing based on previous election results or fundraising data or any other metric that could serve to be a very accurate predictor of who might end up winning these states this coming November. And I think it speaks to a larger problem about my fundamental issue with polls here, that they simply just don't make sense in the modern era. The idea that President Trump leads President Biden in the state of Minnesota by roughly the same exact amount that he leads him by in the state of Pennsylvania just simply doesn't make sense to me. President Trump has a 1.7% advantage in Pennsylvania, a state that President Biden won in the last election by 1 percentage point, as he does in Minnesota. 1.7% in the state of Pennsylvania, 1.6% in the state of Minnesota. The only difference, Biden won Pennsylvania by 1, and he won Minnesota by nearly 8 points. These races are ones that I think really show us that polling is not all there. It isn't all put together in this election cycle, and I think that it serves to us a fundamental problem for predicting elections and forecast models and genuinely understanding this electorate. I would also like us to take a look at some other states too. For instance, Ohio, which shows President Trump leading President Biden by, get this, roughly 8.4%. The 2020 margin of victory was 8.1%. In no reality does it make sense that Ohio, that is harbored in the same region as Minnesota, is shifting just 0.3% to the right, while Minnesota shifts nearly 10 points to the right. These things don't happen. It is very, very rare that these states go so far one way while the rest of the country stays the exact same. And while it may make some sense, for instance, in a battleground state like Ohio, maybe it makes sense that Trump is leading by a slightly larger margin. But it doesn't make sense that Trump is leading in a state like Minnesota. Take a look at my electoral map, for instance. It is clear that Minnesota and Virginia are not at all states that I believe are in contention. And yet, the polls seem to suggest that they are. And while you may be apprehensive to believe me over, statistically speaking, not super inaccurate polls, there is just something so far off about the state of the race when it comes down to the polling industry that I genuinely cannot comprehend how any of these numbers really make sense. To give you another example, we're going to take a step out of the Hill and Decision Desk HQ and take a look at Real Clear Politics. Real Clear Polling is what they call their polling grouping, but it's Real Clear Politics. You can find this on their webpage. Just head over to General Election Polls. And I would just ask you to take a look at any general election polls in battleground states that are conducted by the same pollster and compare them and see if they make sense to you. To give you a bit of context here, we're going to be specifically looking at the state of Florida, a poll conducted by Florida Atlantic University that shows Donald Trump with a 6-point advantage. You know where else Donald Trump has a 6-point advantage? In the state of Arizona. Now that really doesn't make any sense. Arizona in the last election, in the Senate race, voted for Marco Rubio by roughly 17 percentage points. In the governor's race for Ron DeSantis by nearly 20 percentage points. Arizona, however, voted for the Democrats in the governor's race by a point, and in the Senate race by 5 points. The delta there is nearly 25 points in both the governor's race and the Senate race. How does this make sense? How is it possible that Joe Biden is losing to Donald Trump by nearly the exact same margin? And how is it possible that Trump's percent support in Arizona is higher than Florida? Well, it doesn't make sense because it's not true. There is something off about polls. And I think while they do have some level of, fact, and they are rooted in some strong methodologies, strong polling sources, whatever it might be, I think there is validity behind them to an extent. But when I see polls like these, and I see averages like this one, I really call into question, how accurate are these actually going to be? Let's look at another example. Virginia, Minnesota may be the catalyst for this video, but this isn't the only example that we've seen something similar like this arise. Also, sometimes the polls show Biden ahead by 4 points. It really is all over the place. But again, Fox News, for instance, did a poll that shows President Trump winning Florida by less than he wins in Nevada and Arizona. Nevada hasn't backed a Republican since 2004. Hillary Clinton even won Nevada by 2.4. Biden won Nevada. Democrats won Nevada in 2022, 3 out of the 4 House seats. They won the Senate election there. Nevada's not a red state by any metric. The state legislature overwhelmingly Democratic. Everything about that state, sure, is competitive, but ultimately leans blue. And for President Trump to have a larger lead in Nevada than he does in Florida, throw the whole poll out. I think there is reason to trust them to an extent, but we cannot trust them the way we have in previous election cycles, because that's the exact reason we were burned in the 2022 midterms. Why we said Dr. Oz would win Pennsylvania. I'll own up to that. I believed that Dr. Oz was going to win in Pennsylvania. Why? Because I ignored what the special elections were saying. And I thought there's no way in any reality that in a president with an approval rating this low, -15 nationwide, and approval rating this low combined with general election generic ballot polling data that showed Republicans doing 11 points better than 2018, ended up being true, being roughly 8 points better than 2020 when Pennsylvania only went to Biden by 1 point, it didn't make sense to me. Because the polls were telling me exactly what you might expect when you see national numbers that show Republicans ahead by 3 points. Pennsylvania would flip red. Didn't happen. Georgia would flip red. Didn't happen. Arizona would flip red. Didn't happen. New Hampshire would flip red. Didn't happen. You start to see the picture here. Nevada, right? All of these states, Colorado was going to be competitive. Washington was going to be the dark horse. We saw so many polls out of the state, and I have a really big problem with it because we saw so many polls out of the state that said Democrats are up by 3, yet it was actually 14. So, when we look at some of this data, I want us to look at it with caution. I want us to look at it, sure, with some level of, okay, maybe this is showing some pulling away of support from President Biden, but honestly understand that some of these numbers simply cannot coexist in the way that they currently are in the 2024 election polling data. That it does not make sense and never has made sense that some of these states are just as Trump as each other, when in the 2022 midterms, in every special election since then, in 2020, they were so far apart. Again, Real Clear Politics has it all. You can see other examples of this where it is quite egregious. I take point also and problem with Virginia and Minnesota, because often you find that they are less pro-Biden than the national average. For instance, Yahoo News recently did a poll that shows Biden ahead by 2, but Biden ahead by 1 in Virginia, according to Fox News. Now, that doesn't make any sense, because it shouldn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Virginia should not be less for Biden than the national average. Why? Because back in 2020, Biden won the state by 10.1%. This was a double-digit Biden state that we are supposedly supposed to believe is now less Biden than the rest of the country that was just Biden plus 4.5%. It doesn't make sense. No matter how you try to cut it, no matter how much you support President Trump, support President Biden, some of these things just simply don't make sense. And it is the exact reason why in 2022, blindly following the polls, and I don't think it was blindly, but putting too much faith in them can sometimes steer you the wrong way. Just as we have been proven on the Democratic Party side, you can see that in 2016, you can see that in 2020, that there was clearly inaccuracies in the polls and often underestimated President Trump. But then came 2022, where the polls significantly underestimated Democrats and now has thrown this whole thing out of whack. The polls don't make sense. A lot about this election just doesn't make sense. While there is clearly a Donald Trump advantage in many of these battleground states, and I'm not one to contest that. In my most recent prediction, I said Trump is winning in Wisconsin, Trump is winning in Georgia, Trump is winning in Nevada. And because I think at the time, June 1st was when I made the prediction, those numbers made sense. The polls also reiterated that Trump was ahead in these battleground states. Now, they also suggest that Trump is ahead in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Arizona. But I am apprehensive to believe those because I think there's a lot more at play than just what the polls are suggesting. 2022 showed me I could believe that, but I don't ever want to believe, and not even just want to believe, but want us to go about this election treating some states that are very obviously going to be much more beneficial for Biden than what we might be seeing in the polls and treating them like they're toss-ups. We cannot fall into this reality where we are characterizing states that are very solid for President Biden. We're very solid for President Biden as now all of a sudden these newly competitive states, just because the polls are telling us to. These articles are really useless. They aren't going to be flips in 2024. Biden will win Minnesota. Biden will win Virginia. And Republicans going out there, Donald Trump himself speaking to the House Republican caucus, we can win Virginia, we can win Minnesota. Who do you think is telling him that? It's the top Republican officials that are seeing these articles and genuinely believing them. And when Donald Trump ends up losing Wisconsin again by just a handful of votes, but spent $20 million in Virginia just to lose by 9 points instead of 10, that's going to call into question, did that make sense? These articles and these polls here don't do anything for Republicans. And they also don't do much for Democrats either. What they do is build a false narrative. What they do is go in contrast with many other metrics that we are seeing, not only nationally, and I arguably understand that polling firms that are, conducting polls on behalf of news organizations, and the news organizations uplift those polls, that makes sense, right? If CNN, SSRS are doing their own poll nationally, of course they're going to cover that. But when you take a look, for instance, at some other things that they're ignoring because they're uplifting the polls, because they're treating that as, the word of God, right, as the gospel, you can see results like the ones we saw in Ohio and draw completely separate conclusions from what we know about this election. Ohio's 6th district, combined with New York's, the New York district 26th, the New York 3rd district, all the special elections, arguably, the governor elections too, from Kentucky and Louisiana and Mississippi from this last race, almost all of it tells us that Democrats are actually doing better than they did in the last election. And yet, our narrative consistently is Biden is going to lose. And while there may be a reality in which Biden does lose the election, and I don't think right now he's going to lose as of today, and I think it's going to be exceptionally close, we really need to reevaluate how we look at these polls, how accurate they are, because there is clearly something very, very off. I want to go more in depth in this on another video. I think that it definitely deserves more of an autopsy rather than just criticism, because obviously I'm not the ones conducting these polls. I'm not the one going out there, writing the questions, fielding responses, but I do think when we're looking at this from an analytical point of view, we can really, really, really be led astray. And after the last election, I really am not willing to be led astray. I think we do ourselves a disservice by treating these polls again as the word of God, treating these polls as something that is the only indicator for how somebody might be winning, completely ignoring realities that Democrats have the most grassroots donors they've seen in 2024, even more than they saw in 2020, that you're seeing Democratic population increases in some of these battleground states, that President Biden, just plainly put, is performing better in these states than he is in the national average. There is something off, and there is something outside of polling that is telling us that President Biden fares a lot more of a chance at victory than what they suggest. And so I think when we look at those metrics and we actually take them into account, it's the exact reason why President Trump and President Biden are neck and neck in the 538 forecast. There's a reason why President Biden has a high chance at victory in the 538 forecast, even if he is losing in all of the battleground polls. There's a reason for everything. And these polls here are entirely misleading. And while it may not be the fault of any of the polling firms or the polling compilations, some of these things, again, just simply cannot happen at the same time. Florida cannot be just a few points more Republican than Virginia. Florida cannot be just a few points more Republican than Minnesota. These states, come fall 2024, will vote nearly 10 points differently than each other, if not more. If Virginia ends up being another Biden plus 10.1% state, and Florida ends up being Trump plus 13, 14, that's nearly a 20, 25 point difference. Yet the polls would tell us that they're within the margin of error of each other. That doesn't make sense. This has never really made a lot of sense, and that's why I've been so consistently apprehensive to trust these polls as something that should be taken into account as arguably extremely important and that they matter, with no fail. These polls have been wrong before, and I think while we have waited a pretty long time to really understand that, I do think it matters. I think 2024 will be very unpredictable as well. These polls are not going to provide us the best answer, the most accurate answer, and I don't know why that might be. Maybe this election is different and people feel less inclined to back President Biden, or maybe less inclined to tell us that they're backing President Biden. But a lot of these metrics aren't happening on a uniform shift, unlike anything we've ever seen in a modern presidential election in the past 20 years, and I highly doubt that this election is going to be one for the books in that type of way. I don't think we're going to be seeing this massive version of Democratic support in states like Virginia and Minnesota. I entirely expect President Biden to win them again in 2024. The question is, where else does he win? Where does President Trump win, and is it enough to win them the election? Only time will tell. I'm very interested to see them, but I want us to all approach any and all polling from here to November with heavy caution, because it is evident that they cannot all exist at the same time. These leads cannot coexist because they make no sense if they do. While individual firms are free to do things as they like, and of course we can't control the responses and the results that we get. And maybe I'll be proven entirely wrong come November 5th, 2024. But I really don't think I will be, because a lot of this is common sense, a lot of this is electoral math, and none of it seems to be in a point where it is entirely logical. And so that's where all these red flags have been waving for me over the past couple of months in these battleground state polls, in these national polls, and I encourage you to take a look at some of them too and sort of piece them together and ask yourself, does this make sense? So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.